Hi, everyone, and welcome back to track 4, which is quality testing. I hope you had some lunch and that you have maybe some time to go outside and stretch your legs. We have an interesting afternoon in front of us, and our first speaker, he came to Sweden 7 years ago. And when he's not working, he enjoys the beautiful Swedish landscape on his motorbike. But today he will take us into an exciting world. He will give us an explanation on how Volvo Car Breakdowns test efforts, including real-time examples. So I would like to welcome Ruben Smits to give us this presentation. Welcome, Ruben.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Ruben Smits, and in my daily work, I'm working as a solution test architect at Volvo Cars, and I'm working at the department where we are responsible for implementing the famous Android system, the infotainment system that takes care of a lot of user convenience functions. Also, we are responsible for connecting to the cloud and connecting to the internet. So, and I will show you, like it was just mentioned, how we break down our testing to make it feasible to test. So if we take a look at an advertisement, and don't worry, I'm not going to have a sales pitch here, but this advertising is showing some interesting stuff apart from a cool car, of course. If we look at the advertisement, we can see that 9 elements here are related to software and mechatronics. 3 are related to design and 1 is related to interior. So what we learn here is apparently for our customers, software and mechatronics is quite important for in the cars. And I would say it makes sense because a shift is happening in the automotive industry. As you will know, electrification is already ongoing. At Volvo Cars, we sell a couple of models that are fully electrified. At the same time, the car ownership changes towards more car sharing and car subscribing. And also autonomous drive is a very hot topic today. So I can say that in all these parts, our department is quite a lot involved because all these items require a lot of software. And apart from that, it also requires a lot of connectivity. Every day, my car experience is better. This is a vision that a senior manager at Volvo Cars launched a couple of years ago. And I must say, this is, of course, on the first sight, it's quite an easy vision, quite catchy. But if you break it down, there's a lot behind it. If you look at the word experience, that requires a customer focus. And a customer focus also requires customer level testing. If you look at the word every day, that requires that we have a different car every day. So far, all the cars come into workshop like once or twice a year, and at that time we can update the software in the car. But that's not enough anymore. Nowadays, we need to update the software much more often, and that requires software updates over the air, so via internet. Doing so, that requires much more testing. That also requires a one track instead of having different projects. So far, every car model, we give them different software, but that requires way too much testing. So we are moving towards a one-track solution. Functional testing, validation, and non-functional testing become much more important nowadays. If we look further, my car experience gets better. What does that mean? How do we know that our customers are actually happy? We can do A/B testing to understand what our customers consider to be better. But A/B testing, again, it requires much more testing, especially test automation and a complex CI environment. So there's really a lot behind this vision. It requires a lot from the company. You might have heard that we at Volvo Cars, we are creating new partnerships. And I think this is the most well-known, the partnership with Google. Everyone probably has heard about the Android system that we base our infotainment system on. It includes the Google Assistant, the App Store, Google Maps. And this is just one example of new partnerships. We have many more. Connectivity, things like Google Maps, live events on the map, accidents, etc. Once we get autonomous drive on the market and you don't have to watch the road anymore, then streaming media becomes much more important in the car for entertainment, but also active safety, where, for example, the first car notices that the road is slippery. That information can be sent to the cloud, to the Volvo cloud, and the next car can already slow down to take action on it. All examples where connectivity becomes really important, but at the same time, very complex examples. So let's take a deeper look into this testing of these advanced functions. How can we fault trace? We have a big car with massive amount of software in it. How can we fault trace? It's a very long testing path, so it's way too big. If you find an error, you can't see where the error exactly occurs. We implement some fault codes, but these fault codes are more intended for the workshop. If specific hardware would break down, then we set a fault code, and that can be detected in the workshop. But to bug trace, to fault trace in the software, we need more. How can we test all major functions and also look into every detail? The first step is to simplify. In the past, we created cars by having a lot of mechatronic rim connected all together. The mechatronic rim is a bit on the outside of the car, things like sensors, antennas, those kind of things. They all communicate to every other node in the car. But the amount of software is increasing so much that's not possible anymore. So we are moving towards core computing, centralized core computing. And every node in the car, every mechatronic node is talking to this central computing. That makes testing a little bit easier, but we're not there yet. The easy answer is Lego blocks. If we want to test end-to-end, complete functions from begin to end, then we have many points of failure. But if we instead look at small blocks of software with short test cases, then it's much easier to fault trace. And then once these small blocks are working properly, then we can build a complete car with those blocks. And of course, this is very simplified. The whole presentation is very simplified, but this is showing the steps that we take. Let's take a very brief look at the testing journey that we made at Volvo Cars. Before 2014, we mainly tested individual functions. There was not that much software in the cars yet. In 2015, we introduced SPA. Probably everyone knows that scalable platform architecture. That means we are testing a platform here with a lot of software that was introduced together with this platform. But it's still very complex. It's so much software, we need to do more. So today we use integration levels. Now, what do the integration levels look like? At the bottom, we have unit tests. Unit tests are really easy to create. They're cheap and you get very fast feedback. A little bit more complex becomes component testing, but still quite easy to set up and quite fast. Then we get the domain level. At Volvo Cars, we use roughly 7 domains. Think about the engine domain, the infotainment domain, and so we have a few other domains as well. And then the domains come together in a complete vehicle. And this can be a complete electrical system, but it can also be a complete car, depending on the testing needs. If you look at this from a different perspective, then we can have the testing pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have the unit test. Like I said, these are really easy to create. They're cheap, so we want to have as much coverage in unit test as possible. Component test is still quite easy to set up, but you need a little bit more in your test environment. So we still have a lot of component test. Then we go to domain test, which is already quite a complicated test environment. And at the top, we have complete level. And yeah, complete level, sometimes we need to go there, but we try to prevent it because it's a very complicated and very expensive test environment. Very briefly, what is every integration level used for? Unit testing is mainly for individual software functions, complex calculations, and software interfaces. Component testing is quite good to do white box testing and black box testing. And white box testing simply means that you can inject faults and you can read out internal signals within a component. If you do black box testing, then you only look at the outside of the box. So that means that you can send in some signals and you can measure what's coming out of the box. Then we have domain testing. This is mainly used for functional tests, for integration testing, and for non-functional behavior. So at this level, we can already test a lot of user functions, domain testing. And then in the top, we have complete level. And here we mainly do cross-domain functionality testing. So really big functions that go across multiple domains. We can test it here. And this level is also suitable to do some end-to-end verification. Now let's look at a real life example. The My Volvo app can, on the phone, the app, it can show the charging level of your electrical car. So the function is you open the app on your phone and you want to look at the charging level. At that point, the phone requests information from the Volvo cloud. And then the cloud sends the charging level and it's displayed on the phone. How is this implemented behind the scenes? We have a phone, we have the cloud, and we have a car. The car sends the charging level on specific intervals to the Volvo cloud. When you open the app on the phone, then it requests the charging level to the cloud, and the cloud provides that information to the app on the phone. So we have a phone part, we have a cloud part, and we have an onboard part, the car itself. So if we look at the car itself, what can we test on that side? First, we need to know if the charging level is available in the car. To do so, we can do some unit testing and we can do some component testing. And then the next step is that this information needs to be provided to the cloud. So here we can do a unit test for the interface to the cloud. And we also can do some component testing to see that it's actually sending the information to the cloud. Then if we take a look at the offboard system, that's the cloud, the Volvo cloud. First step is that the cloud needs to interpret the signal that it receives from the car. So again, we have an interface here and a unit test is ideal to test interfaces. And then we can also test the cloud app, which is a component test that takes care of interpreting the signal. Then the next step, once the cloud has received this signal, it still needs to process the signal and it needs to store the signal somewhere. So again, we do a unit test and a component test there. Then we take a look at the phone part. And here it's quite similar. The phone starts by requesting the cloud for information. What is the charging level? So again, we have an interface to the cloud. There we do unit testing. And we do a component test on the phone app. When the phone receives the information back from the cloud, again, the interface is tested by unit test, and we can do a component test as well. And the final step here is the phone actually needs to display the information on the screen. So also here we can do a unit test and a component test. So these were unit test and component test. Apart from that, we also do a domain test. Since all these elements, the phone, the parts in the vehicle, and the cloud are all part of the same domain. So simply said, we first test the onboard handling in the car itself. Is the car sending the signal to the cloud? Then we check the cloud, if the cloud is actually processing that information. And then in the end, we see that the information is arriving at the phone and it's displayed at the phone. So this is a domain test. So you see that we have split things into very small parts, unit test, to test small calculations and interfaces, and component test. We do a lot of component testing here to actually see that the individual steps are handled. And then we do a domain test to look at the bigger picture. Okay, let's take a look at another example. In the car, we can set the climate, the temperature, via the Android system. How does this function work? Probably the one who drives a car, you will know how this works. On the screen, you set the temperature, in this case via the Android interfaces, and that can be either the touch screen in the car or it can be the Google Assistant. So you can talk to the car and then the temperature is set as well. So again, let's take a look at how this is implemented. We can set the temperature on the screen, the touch screen, or alternative, we can use the Google Assistant. No matter which one we pick here, the information is sent to a head unit in the car. The head unit processes this information, and then the information is sent to the climate domain. So here we have two different domains in the car. So that means we need to test cross-domain here. Let's look at the infotainment domain. And then the first example where we set the temperature via the touchscreen. So when we touch the screen, we send a request to the system. This request is processed, and first we do a unit test because we have an interface between the screen and the actual head unit doing the calculations. And then in the head unit, we can do the component test for the actual calculations. And then the next step is to forward the information to the climate domain. And here in the climate domain, we have an interface because we send information from one domain to another domain. So again, we can do a unit test and we can do a component test in the climate domain as well. These component tests are the same test case. When processing the request, we put information into the component. When we forward the request to the climate domain, we read what's coming out of the component. So this is a one black box component test. The same example, but now we use the Google Assistant. Then it's a bit similar. So in this situation, we receive a request from the Android system, and then we process the request. And we pass the request on. So it's quite similar to the previous slide. And we see that the same component tests are done here. And this is exactly the same test as in the previous slide. But here we have an additional unit test when we receive the information from the Android system. I said that we are testing here between two domains. If you recall this picture from a previous slide, here we see we are in this level, two domains where we need to do the testing. And we do that testing on domain level. But that's not all, because since we are cross-domain testing, we also need to test here on complete vehicle level. And I explained in the beginning, the complete vehicle level is a very complex environment. So we try to have as little as possible from this kind of testing. We try to have all the functionality in one domain that makes testing much easier. So in the first domain, we set the temperature. And in the climate domain, then we measure that the temperature is actually increased or decreased as we set it. So this is kind of end-to-end testing cross-domain. Okay, then we have a third example where we have phone as a key. Phone as a key is a quite new function. The function works as follows. You have your phone with you, you approach the car with the phone, then the car detects that the phone is approaching, and then the car unlocks. Now these are very simple steps, but in reality it's much more complicated. So we have a person, has a phone, and we have a car, very simplified. The person is approaching the car. Then the car detects that the phone is approaching. So in this situation, the car sends this information to the cloud. Hey, Volvo Cloud, I noticed that this specific phone is approaching. What should I do? Then the Volvo Cloud communicates with the cloud from the phone supplier to get the actual approval. And the information is sent back to the Volvo Cloud. And then that information is processed and then forwarded to the car. And in the end, the car unlocks. This is quite magic, I would say, because this all happens in a split second. So it needs to be very efficient. And just to make clear, the parts in the circle is where Volvo is involved, and there's another part where the phone supplier is involved. So the phone supplier has their own cloud and they implement stuff in the phone as well. If we look at the Volvo parts, then we can see roughly two parts here. One is the onboard system, what's happening in the car, and we can look at what's happening in the cloud. If we look at the onboard testing, so the things that are happening in the car, then it starts with some sensors that are detecting that the phone is approaching. And for these sensors, we do a component test. And we can do that on a very small scale. So we simulate the signal of an approaching phone, and then we measure that the sensors are actually sending out the information, that it detects something. Then we need to look at the sensor signal handling. And this is kind of calculations. So we do unit test here and we do component test. And then the next step is this information is sent to the cloud, and then we receive information back from the cloud. So again, in the car, we look at the receiving signal, that's an interface. So interface, then we do a unit test. And then in the end, we need to act on the cloud response, meaning we need to unlock the car. So again, these are some calculations because there's a lot of encryption involved as well, of course. It's very secure. So we need to do quite a lot of unit testing here, and we do component testing as well. So this is the part that's happening in the car itself. Then in the Volvo cloud, there's also happening a lot. First, the signal is coming from the cloud. The car is, sorry, I say it wrong. The signal is coming from the car. The car is telling the cloud like, hey, I detect that a phone is approaching. So the cloud needs to interpret this signal. Again, we have an interface, so we do unit testing and we do component testing. The next step is we need to process that signal in the cloud. Again, unit testing, component test. Then Volvo Cloud communicates to the cloud from the phone supplier. And again, we have an interface between two clouds. So that's where we do unit testing, and we also do some calculations. So that's component testing. The part where the phone supplier is involved, I keep that out of this slide because that's not something that we at Volvo are doing. But then we receive information back from the phone supplier, and we need to interpret that signal. So again, we have an interface to a cloud, so we do unit testing. And apart from that, we do component testing. Then we need to process that signal. So again, we have unit test and component test. And in the end, we need to respond to the car. So we send information from the Volvo cloud to the car. And again, we have an interface. So we do unit testing, and we have a component test for the actual signal. So there's really a lot of different levels of testing here. These are all unit test and component test. And apart from that, we also do a domain test. And the blue line here is where we do some simulations, because that's the part where the cloud from the phone supplier is involved. And to keep things simple in testing, we keep that out of the equation. So we simulate that. It starts on the left with triggering the sensors. Then we need to handle the signal within the vehicle, within the car. Then we need to communicate to the Volvo cloud. The Volvo cloud needs to interpret that signal. The Volvo cloud needs to send information to the phone supplier. And in this situation, that's a simulated cloud. Then we receive information back from that phone supplier. We need to process that information. And then we send the information back to the car, and the car is unlocking. So here you see that we split it up in very small parts in a domain test. And in this situation, since this is a very complicated function technically wise, we also do an end-to-end test here, which looks quite the same as the previous slide. But here we also test on the actual cloud from the phone supplier. So that's a small change, but it's quite similar to the previous one. Okay, then a summary. Unit testing, very small test cases. We use it for individual functions. We use it for interfaces and for complex calculations. Component testing becomes a little bit bigger, but it's still quite easy to set up. Then we have detailed functionality, small functions that we can test. When we do white box testing, we can do fault injections. We can read out internal signals. And when we do black box testing, we test incoming and outgoing signals. The domain is already quite big, quite complex. It's really suitable to test integration, user functions. We try to test it on this level. And domain is also very suitable for testing non-functional behavior. And then sometimes we need to go to a complete system. And that's really for end-to-end testing for cross-domain functions. So what we see here, we have broken down the big dragon, and we can still test a very big car, but we need to split it in small parts. And that's how we break it down at Volvo Cars. And then we can really do proper testing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a super interesting presentation. You have in the audience, do you have any questions to Ruben? You can unmute if you would like to raise them directly.
I have one question. I'm Kai.
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay. Dankjewel, Ruben, voor de presentatie. Can you give an example of how your test lab looks like? I mean, do you break down the components of the car? For example, the phone is a key mechanism where you have the head unit only to the lock connected, for example, or yeah. Can you just give an example of how your test lab looks like?
Yes, sure. As you maybe understand, the car is built out of small components, all being small computers. And those individual computers we have connected together with some wires on a table, on a desk. And that's basically how you start when you test on a small level. We also test on, when I mentioned complete level testing, that can be a complete electrical system. And in that situation, we have all those individual computers, all those individual boxes. We have them on a very big desk, and that's what we call a box car. And we try to have the complete electrical system working there. But then we're talking about a really big desk filled with electrical wires, etc. So it depends a lot on what level you are testing. And of course, when we're talking about unit testing, then it's even smaller, and unit testing is usually done at the computer where you develop the software. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the example.
Good.
Any more questions? I guess you can always come back to Ruben as well with different questions.
Yes, absolutely.
I assume that if you would like to work with tests in this way, you also need, you can't have too many dependencies to other things that you might need to test. You need to have a quite modelized architecture to be able to work in this way. Is that true? Or?
Yes, that's absolutely true. We have spent a lot of time to exactly define the perfect domains. And of course, it's never perfect, but it's very important that you can test as many user functions in one domain as possible. That really improves testability a lot. That reduces dependencies. Otherwise, you almost always need to go to a complete car to do your testing, and that's very expensive and time-consuming. So absolutely, there need to be a big focus on reducing complexity and also reducing dependencies.
I can imagine that.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions to Ruben?
Yes, hello. My name is Juha Kempinen. I would like to ask, when someone develops the functions, like a group develops a function, do they, I guess they do the unit testing themselves, and do they then give you a report when you start testing it with the rigs and that we have already tested this, or do you anyway start all over and not trust what they have tested? I don't know.
No, at Volvo Cars, we work in an agile way. And that means we need to have trust in the people working here and people doing their work. And it's indeed, like you say, the developers, they create their own test cases. And on bigger integration levels, then of course they need support in the test environment, but actual creation of the test cases, they do themselves. And they also follow up the results of their test cases. And if they see that something is failing, then they report it themselves and they need to take action. Yeah, so the developers are fully responsible themselves, and they provide test results in some central system where everyone can see the progress. And then we can see like, okay, this component has a lot of failures, so maybe we need to do some refactoring there. And this component is really stable, so maybe that can go into production. So yes, we collect all the test results centrally, and we trust the work that the developers are doing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for interesting presentation.
We have one, I think, final question in the chat, and that is all testing automated, or do you do manual exploratory testing as well?
It's a good question. A lot of our testing is automated, but it will never be possible in not a single company. It will be possible to reach 100% automation. So there will always be some manual testing as well. Sometimes it's too complicated to automate. Sometimes it's simply not efficient to automate. So yes, we also have some manual test cases, but we have a very high pace in releasing software. So that means that if you need to do manual testing, that is an enormous time pressure. We release new software every week. And if you need to repeat your manual test cases every week, that's not very helpful. So we try to minimize manual test cases as much as possible. But on the other hand, we also do some exploratory testing. That's also a different way of manual testing. And exploratory testing is becoming more and more important. And that means driving around in the actual cars and testing all the functions, or doing the same thing, but in a limited test environment, playing around with the functions. So that's a different kind of manual testing that's becoming more and more important now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, Ruben. This is a really interesting area, and I think we will see a lot more of this in the future. So I suggest we take a couple of minutes break, 2 minutes, until we have our next speaker. So thanks a lot again, Ruben.
Thank you too.
Hey, Linda.